Today, I am standing here to talk to you about a very specific kind of internal traffic light, one that actually controls the entire flow of your body's energy. When this metabolic light is shining green, all of the traffic is being directed straight toward your fat stores, making absolutely sure they stay completely full. But on the other hand, when its light turns a bright red, the storage of fat is strictly forbidden. To leave the storage. Well, the traffic light I'm referring to is insulin. When we were kids, we were told that insulin was just a simple key, but the truth is that it's not a key. It's the master switch that tells your body either we store energy or we burn it, because you can't do both things at the same time. And what's the problem with all of this? Well, if your insulin is always high, your body is constantly ordered not to release a single drop of fat, no matter how much you run or how much you stop eating. In other words, you could be living flooded with energy, but it's energy you can't access. And do you know what's the most frustrating part of all this? That you've been blaming yourself for years. You look at yourself in the mirror and think you lack willpower, that you're not disciplined enough. You think your genetics have simply decided to betray you because you're overweight and can't lose weight. But that's not the case. What's happening to you has absolutely nothing to do with your character. It's something much colder, more precise, and often induced, because it's a programming error in your biological operating system. And I'm going to tell you something that might make you uncomfortable. This error has been induced. It has been programmed by theories that tell you that you have to eat a little bit many times throughout the day to keep your metabolism active. In other words, as if your body were a stove that turns off if you don't throw in a few sticks every 2 hours. But also, for living in an eternal spring with artificial light until midnight and a constant temperature of 21 degrees Celsius so as not to suffer. Well, all this noise is shouting one thing to your software. We are in a time of abundance, so don't stop storing up, because harder times will come later. And to make it simple for you, just imagine that your body is like an ATM, a machine designed for you to deposit your money when you have extra and to withdraw it when you need it. Well, it turns out that it's more than likely your software has a bug, but it's a serious one. The physical cash dispensing slot has simply and completely disappeared from sight. Your personal checking account is currently overflowing with unpaid bills, which represents your stored body fat. But the specific withdraw cash button has simply vanished entirely from the digital screen. And it's not that you don't have money, it's just that the program has decided that today, tomorrow, and the day after, only deposits are accepted. You are full of money on the inside, but you can't even pay for a coffee because you don't have access to your own wealth. And when that financial capital just remains sitting there accumulating, effectively blocking the exits, that's when the logistics go entirely and completely haywire. And what does it mean for the logistics to go completely haywire? Well, it's very simple. Imagine a bank where trucks keep bringing in sacks of coins, but the exit door is boarded up. At first, you store them in the safe, but soon you have to start piling them up in the hallways, then on top of the tables, on top of the offices, and eventually they block all the corridors, even the air ducts, all the way to the air ducts. Well, that's exactly what happens to your body. That energy you can't withdraw doesn't just sit there waiting. It simply becomes a physical hindrance that suffocates your organs, disrupts your communications, and ends up dirtying the electrical wires of your system, what was meant to be a life insurance, your savings, has turned into an obstacle that prevents your internal engineering from working. And it turns out you've gone from having a treasure to having a real logistical collapse. And what's the problem with all this? Well, with so much appearance of abundance, your switch has simply gotten stuck. Your body has received a single command order and doesn't know how to cancel it. You've told it, accumulate. Every time you snack on something, every time you have that little meal so you don't feel hungry, every time you spare your body from shocks or temperature changes, or every day you spend hours and hours under artificial lights tricking your body, what you're really doing is hammering the switch, soldering it more and more firmly into the charging position. And as long as that command remains active, your system will have simply forgotten completely how to drain the swamp. In other words, your structure is sinking. The foundations are rotting under the stagnant water, yet your software keeps trying to pour in more and more water. And at this specific point in time, please don't get me wrong, because today I am definitely not here to talk about restrictive diets. That would be like staying on the surface of something similar to the nutrition rules you see in those magazines at doctors' offices. What I'm actually going to do now is go down there with you deep into the engine room with a manual of physics in hand, so that you can truly begin to understand that insulin is not at all that simple friendly little key they showed you back in school. In the reality of your biophysics, insulin is a quantum polarity switch. But don't look at me like that. A what? All right, let me briefly explain to you what a quantum polarity switch is. Just imagine a magnet. You already know that magnets have two sides, one that attracts and another that pushes away or repels. Well, polarity is simply that, the direction in which the force travels. And I call it quantum because the change actually happens at such an infinitely small level in the basic electricity of your cells that there simply is no middle ground. Either the magnet is in attract mode, meaning storing fat, or it's in push or repel mode, meaning releasing that fat or energy to use it and clean out the system. You have to understand this. There are no half measures. And I'm telling you this very seriously. As long as your switch is stuck in the attract position, or if you prefer, using the term that matters to us, in the charging position, because you keep sending it signals, it's physically impossible. And I want to emphasize this. Under the most sacred laws of thermodynamics, your body cannot access its own reserves. It doesn't matter how much you suffer. It doesn't matter how much you run on a treadmill. You could have run an entire marathon. Your body will not draw from its reserves. They're simply off limits. If the flow vector of your energy is pointing inward, nothing, absolutely nothing is going to come out. You're trying to empty a pool while at the same time you have 10 hoses filling it at full pressure. And this is the problem. And moreover, it's probably the one that no one has ever explained to you, explained until now. Well, today we are finally going to learn exactly how to flip that internal switch so that the deep cleansing process can at last begin. And I truly hope you have fully understood the immense importance of what I am just about to tell you right now. Now, I want you to take a moment and consider then this. I don't want you to visualize your metabolism as a simple furnace where you just keep throwing in coal. because that is really an outdated concept from the past. What I truly want is for you to see it as an incredibly complex electrical circuit. In the field of electrical engineering, a switch is that simple yet vital device that decides precisely where the electric current flows. Think about it, like a train track. The switch is the lever that decides whether the train goes to the right or to the left, but it can't go both ways at the same time. Well, in your Cathedral, that role is played by Sergeant Insulin, but today we're also going to look at the Sergeant Insulin in his dress uniform as the director of flows. Because up until now, you've been told that insulin rises or falls as if it were the tide. But the reality is much more fascinating, because what insulin actually does is invert the polarity of your life. And to explain this in perhaps simpler terms, insulin, thank you. It reverses the direction of the energy's journey. Imagine a narrow, one-way street. When insulin suddenly appears in the system, it effectively puts up a bright traffic sign that clearly dictates all traffic must flow inward. And when insulin disappears, the sign changes and says all traffic goes outward. It's impossible for traffic to go in both directions at the same time without the trucks crashing. It's either one or the other. And that's why, when I tell you that insulin reverses the polarity of your life, what I'm really saying is that it's the one that decides whether today you're going to store or today you're going to clean. Whenever your body's insulin levels remain significantly high, your entire system enters into what I personally like to call a state of charging mode. And this is where the biophysics of your cells comes in. Each of your cells has a membrane, a skin that surrounds it, and that skin has a voltage, like a battery. We've talked about this in other videos. Well, in this charging mode, that voltage is oriented exclusively toward importing, or to put it in a way you'd understand if you were 10 years old. Imagine that the cell turns into a giant vacuum cleaner, and all the sugar and nutrients passing near the bloodstream are sucked inside with tremendous force. In other words, the cell becomes a kind of black hole where nothing escapes. Everything goes in. It's a moment of massive construction, but also, as happens at any construction site, debris is generated at the same time. And if trucks loaded with bricks keep coming into your cathedral 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, at first it's clear that you built some beautiful walls, but in the end you can't even move through the hallways because the leftover material is flooding everything. That's the feeling of being heavy, inflamed, and lacking spark. You end up turning into a storage depot for construction materials that your body has sucked in, but the reality is that right now it doesn't know where to put them. And you might ask yourself, so how do I get the vacuum cleaner to stop sucking in and start letting go? And it is right at this point that I would really like to introduce you to a very wise man, the esteemed Dr. George Cahill. Cahill was a Harvard professor who dedicated his life to understanding fasting and metabolism, and through his work he demonstrated something that completely changed the entire field of medicine. The body has a master switch that allows you to stop burning sugar and start burning your own fat. But for that switch to flip, we need what I call electrical silence. And what is that? Well, look, it's very simple. Every molecule of insulin floating in your blood is like a pulse of current that keeps the system constantly in charging mode. As long as Sergeant Insulin is present, it is constantly emitting a signal, a chemical noise that blocks any other communication. It is essentially like trying to catch a faint whisper while standing in the middle of a loud rock concert. You see, so that you understand it as the engineer of your own body, which you are or should become. Insulin is not just a hormone, it's also a high-frequency transmitter. And when what I call Sergeant Insulin, or when insulin enters the room, it does so with a giant megaphone, and its instructions are top priority. Deep within your cell's biological software system, there is a hierarchy of genetic instructions that explicitly dictates that if insulin is present, it must completely disregard any other supply orders. It's what in engineering we would call a frequency inhibitor or a jamming system. And why does it block communication? You might ask me. Well, think of it this way. Your fat reserves are trying to send out a radio message saying, "Attention, we're here, you can use us as fuel." And that message is just a faint whisper, a very weak signal. But meanwhile, insulin, which is like a cell tower antenna broadcasting at full power right next to it, its chemical pulses saturate the cell's receptors. Technically, this happens because insulin activates a signaling pathway that by sheer biological hierarchy shuts down the machinery that should be reading the fat-burning commands. You see, it's not that the receptor doesn't want to listen, it's that it physically can't process two contradictory signals at the same time. It either hears the roar of insulin or the whisper of fat. There is no middle ground. And that's why I just talked to you about the need for electrical silence. You see, it's not just about not eating. In fact, what's truly important is to let the radio frequency of your blood clear itself of interference. And only when the sergeant finally deactivates his megaphone and slowly begins to step away, does the intense background noise subside significantly enough for your internal operating system to clearly recognize that it has finally received the official permission to open the heavy reinforced bunker. That's why the first step is not to eat less. The first step is simply to turn off the noise. We need the insulin sergeant to take a moment to step back and get some rest and stop sending out his signal. And only when the sergeant leaves and the line finally goes silent is when the magic happens. It is at that moment when the system detects that the charging signal has disappeared, and by pure emergency protocol, what it does is activate flight mode or catabolic mode. That's it. Thank you. That is the moment when your internal engineering, no longer receiving outside orders, decides that it's time to start consuming its own reserves. Pay close attention to what happens now, because this is where the engineering gets really interesting. When insulin disappears because it has left, the cell's voltage changes direction. This is what we call in biophysics the electrochemical gradient. But don't be intimidated by the name. Imagine a balloon that's very inflated. If the air is packed tightly, you open the nozzle and the air shoots out, right? That's its gradient. The force that pushes things from where there's a lot to where there's little. When the insulin levels were significantly high, the metaphorical wind blew steadily into the cell. But if those insulin levels suddenly drop, the wind changes its direction entirely, and then the internal pressure pushes outward with great force. Well, it's at that precise moment, and not a second before, that your fat cells, that is, the adipocytes, finally get the electrical permission to open their gates. Think of it like a traffic light on a busy one-way street that suddenly changes its color. And it is exactly at that moment when all of that stored energy, which is essentially your hard-earned savings, can finally come to the surface to be utilized. This important process is what we commonly refer to as export. And at this very point, I really need you to understand exactly how serious this situation is. You see, if we live in a world where we constantly have breakfast at 8 in the morning, a small snack at 11, then have a full lunch at 2 in the afternoon, and a late dinner at 10 at night, then Sergeant Insulin simply never leaves your system. We always have him standing right there at the door, shouting through his megaphone. And what happens then? Well, it's very simple. Since the sergeant never rests, the switch I mentioned stays permanently in the charging position. It's as if it were welded shut. And in that situation, physics becomes absolutely relentless because of the law of thermodynamics. It is a fundamental biological fact that you simply cannot charge and discharge a battery through the exact same cable at the very same time. Furthermore, you won't ever be able to change this difficult situation unless you actively work to lower your insulin levels significantly. Because if the switch says charge, your body will go into a state of panic if it lacks energy. And just think about how crazy that is. It really doesn't matter if you have just finished the grueling task of climbing Mount Everest. Your body, which is completely unable to open the metaphorical fat door because the internal electric lock is being blocked by high insulin levels, will unfortunately prefer to devour its own healthy muscle tissue instead. It is essentially your own complex internal biological wiring that forces the body to seek out some immediate fuel long before it even considers touching a single gram of all that deeply stored and stubbornly accumulated body fat. Do you realize that? It turns out that you are actually starving, right in the middle of a truly magnificent and great feast. Your digital storage is completely full, but unfortunately, you have now lost the physical ability to flip the switch to access it. And this is perhaps even more serious. In reality, what you've lost is sovereignty over your own body and your own life. Just think about how serious this is. But you see, to truly understand the tragedy of this blockage, what we need to do is travel to the exact place where all that excess that we simply can't use is stored. Now let's enter the storerooms of your cathedral. Let's get to know the adipocyte, that is, your fat cell. You see, many people think that fat is just a dead mass that we have left over, but the reality is very different from that. In fact, nothing could be further from the truth than that interpretation. The adipocyte is a compartment of high engineering. Imagine it as if it were an elastic safety backpack. And inside that backpack, we store energy in the form of triglycerides. And here comes the technical detail. The triglyceride is actually a very large and complex molecule. It is essentially like a bulky, oversized package that simply cannot fit through the narrow exit door of the backpack. So, for that energy to leave the backpack and enter the bloodstream to feed your brain or your muscles, first, it has to be unpacked. And not only that, it also has to be broken down into small pieces. And this is exactly where our star worker comes into the picture, the highly skilled engineer known as HSL. Inside each and every individual storage unit, or what we call each adipocyte, there lives an absolutely essential worker, the hormone-sensitive lipase, which you and I will simply call HSL for short. And what, you might wonder, is her primary daily maintenance job within the body? Well, it's very simple. She is in charge of the scissors. When the body needs energy, HSL rushes to those big packages, that is, the triglycerides, and cuts them into small pieces, meaning fatty acids, and then pushes them toward the exit. In her absence, the energy remains present, but as I said, it remains completely trapped. To help you better picture it in your mind, the situation could be very similar to having something like $10 million stored in 50 heavy kilograms of solid gold bars. In other words, you have a lot of money, but you can't use it to buy bread simply because no one can move that 50-kilo gold bar. But now notice the contradiction happening inside your bunker, the one we're in right now. You have engineer HSL with scissors in hand, ready to cut up those gold bars and put them into circulation. But then, quite suddenly and completely without warning, the heavy door bursts wide open. Sergeant Insulin rushes into the room and shouts out loudly, "Freeze, everyone! Stay exactly where you are. Absolutely nobody touches the precious savings stored here." And why does the sergeant do this? Is it because he wants to see us fat or inflamed? No. What happens is that a cathedral is a machine of extreme efficiency designed by evolution, and Sergeant Insulin is basically the head of supplies, and his logic is relentless. If I am in the bloodstream, it's because a truckload of fresh food has just come in through the main door. That's what he thinks. So then, why on earth would we use up what we already have stored in the freezer if fresh food is coming in? This is so you really understand it. It's like coming home with 3 bags full of groceries and seeing your partner taking food out of the freezer. What would you say to them? It's very simple. Come on, no. Put away what's already in the freezer because we're going to eat what I just brought from the supermarket. Because if we don't eat it, it's just going to go bad. Well, it's exactly the same thing. The problem is that in the modern world, the food truck never stops unloading. Like I was saying, breakfast at 8, a snack at 11, lunch at 2, the truck never stops. And so the sergeant never gives permission for the HSL to start breaking down its savings because we always have insulin present. And now that you understand why it stops it, let's also see how it does it, because the sergeant, actually he doesn't use words. What he does is use a blocking mechanism. To stop the HSL, insulin uses an internal communication system called the phosphorylation cascade. You see, think of a large factory where the boss can't go to each employee to give them orders. So instead, he uses a system of switches in a chain. Insulin does exactly the same thing. Insulin presses a button at the cell's entrance, and that button activates another one in the hallway, and that one in turn activates a final brake on the HSL machine. And scientifically, what happens is that a phosphate group is added to the protein. Think of it, think of this not as a sticker, but as a remote software lock. It's as if a signal was sent from the central office that locks the keyboard of the HSL engineer. She tries to cut the packages, but her scissors simply don't respond because they've been locked. The loading software has revoked her work permissions. And as long as the sergeant is shouting at the door, the HSL is unplugged. And it's unplugged because of this chemical command. That's why, as I was telling you before, no matter how many marathons you run, no matter how many times you climb, the lock is complete. If the HSL can't cut the packages, there won't be any fuel for your muscles. But the situation becomes significantly more critical and serious, because it's not just that the engineer can't work, it's that the entire structure becomes completely inaccessible to everyone. And this is exactly where Dr. Benjamin Bickman provided us with the absolutely essential and definitive key to understanding this whole process. Pickman discovered that high insulin not only gives chemical orders, thank you, it is similar to inhibiting the function of HSL, but it also fundamentally alters the physical properties of the cell. It effectively transforms its entire structure. The conductivity of the potassium channels in the membrane of the fat cell, and this causes what we call hyperpolarization. To ensure you fully understand me, basically, insulin works by making the cell's internal voltage so incredibly strong that it effectively creates a powerful protective electric force field all around it. The fat cell known as the adipocyte becomes a formidable and impenetrable bunker, heavily armored and electrified. Do you remember adrenaline? Well, that's the hormone you produce when you exercise, and it should be shouting, "Quick, release the fat, I'm running here." However, because of this formidable voltage wall that insulin has effectively built up, that urgent chemical message from the adrenaline simply cannot find a way to get inside the cell. It bounces off the electric shield. This is the most incredibly cruel and frustrating paradox in all of biology. Your fat cell is overflowing with vast amounts of stored energy, and the engineer HSL is eager to get to work, but the building is completely closed. Everything is locked up tight, the phone lines have been cut off, and the heavy steel doors are dangerously electrified. You are essentially dying of cellular hunger right in the middle of an overwhelming and massive flood of potential energy. And this isn't because you lack willpower. This is a total technical blockade. It's important that you understand it this way. What a scenario I'm painting for you. But it's a real scenario, and I'd rather you know about it. Because maybe you didn't know it was like this. And if you don't know, you won't be able to act. Therefore, it's better to know so you can take action. And I also imagine you might feel a bit overwhelmed because I've just introduced you to your own electrified bunker. The HSL enzyme with its arms forcefully crossed and a bunch of fat packages that you simply can't get rid of. What I'm talking to you about is a situation of real logistical chaos. But do you know what's most incredible about your cathedral? This equipment is specifically engineered for the most extreme survival situations. And if we can't successfully extract the stored energy out of the backpack, it has been revealed that the system actually has a secondary backup contingency plan. And this is where you're going to be surprised. The system starts to clear the hallways so that at least the machinery that still works doesn't rust. Now, in order to successfully activate this comprehensive plan, we first really need to get to know the two primary foremen of your body. Inside the complex engine room of every single one of your cells, there are basically two master sensors that are locked in a constant, never-ending battle for total control of your system, of the switch. They are mTOR and MPK. Look, imagine it like this. They are two rival construction foremen who harbor a deep-seated, intense hatred for each other, and absolutely never, under any possible scenario or circumstances, can they be permitted to work on the same shift together. If one enters the room, the other jumps out the window. The first is mTOR. He serves as the primary foreman working directly under Sergeant Insulin, and while his official technical name is the target of rapamycin, to those of us on the ground, he is known simply as the construction foreman. Whenever mTOR is switched on and active, there is only one single command issued to the entire system: grow and multiply. It's a constant state of construction. Fresh new bricks are continuously brought in and scaffolding goes up high. But as inevitably happens in any busy construction site that never truly stops, a massive amount of trash starts to pile up everywhere. Discarded empty paint cans, broken debris, dangerous exposed wires, and heavy piles of leftover cement. And under the command of this mTOR, the cathedral grows. Yes, of course it grows, but it fills up with dirt that no one stops to sweep away. The second one is AMPK. This is the logistics and survival engineer. And this is where science gets truly fascinating. You see, how does the AMPK engineer know when it's time to step in? Because he doesn't look at the food. What he looks at is your batteries. Technically, what AMPK measures is the ratio between ATP and AMP. To help you truly understand this complex concept, let us look at it again as if we were little children. Imagine that every single molecule of ATP is like a beautiful shiny gold coin, which is absolutely full of potential energy and is always ready to be spent on whatever the cell needs to do. And when you use that energy, the coin eventually transforms and turns into AMP, which is like an old copper coin, weightless and almost, as we might say, empty. So when the AMPK engineer detects that your cathedral is full of those spent copper coins, that is a lot of AMP, and there are very few gold coins, that is very little ATP, then he goes into a kind of controlled panic. But he doesn't just press a button. What he does is enter the control room and carry out a real boarding maneuver. He activates an emergency signal that says something like, "Gentlemen, construction is over. From now on, we're switching to saving and cleaning mode." But as it happens, it turns out that the cellular cleaning process, or autophagy to use the technical term in this case, simply cannot begin if the construction foreman, known as mTOR, is still actively occupied with building new walls. So, in the end, this is a matter of software priority. We either build or recycle because there aren't enough resources here for both. And so, AMPK effectively does two different things simultaneously. First, it directly attacks the mTOR pathway, and then physically blocks it from functioning. Just imagine for a moment if the emergency crisis engineer suddenly disconnected the foreman's heavy-duty cement mixer. That's exactly what it does. Because while mTOR is powered on, autophagy will be blocked, and therefore AMPK has to knock out the constructor as its first action. But then comes the second one. Once it has silenced the construction, AMPK runs toward what is truly the cleaning machine and gives it an electric jolt to wake it up. That scientists call that phosphorylation. And it is at that precise moment when the builder is knocked out and the cleaning machinery has received its jolt that the blueprints discovered by Yoshinori Ohsumi are activated, and I'm going to tell you about them next. This process marks the formal commencement of cellular autophagy. And I'm quite sure you've likely heard the scientific word autophagy before. It basically and literally means to eat oneself. But I really want you to fully understand the incredible magnitude of what Dr. Yoshinori Ohsumi discovered, which is the exact reason why he was rightfully awarded the prestigious Nobel Prize in Medicine back in 2016. Ohsumi didn't just say that the cell cleans itself. No, he used yeast, which for a biophysicist are something like tiny simplified versions of your cathedral, of our body. And he did this to find the exact blueprints for cleaning the ATG genes. And he discovered that when AMPK gives the order, the cell creates an astonishing piece of engineering machinery, the autophagosome. And now just imagine that it's a kind of double-membraned garbage bag, like a reinforced bubble. The autophagosome travels through the corridors of your cell, searching for old proteins, mitochondria that no longer spark, and those caramelized receptors that sugar has rendered useless. It wraps them up in that bag and takes them straight to the lysosome. The lysosome it functions as the cell's specialized smelting furnace and recycling center. And there, through a series of powerful, highly acidic digestive enzymes, all that cellular garbage is broken down into its most fundamental building blocks and basic parts, amino acids, and simple fats, much like loose Lego pieces. And here's where the truly remarkable brilliance of the chief engineer comes into play once again. It turns out your body doesn't throw those pieces away. It uses them to build new shiny components. This is the ultimate optimization of entropy. Instead of letting disorder destroy the cathedral, what we do is use our own waste to restore the pillars. But pay attention, and this is vital for you to understand. This precise cleaning only happens when there is the electrical silence I mentioned to you a few minutes ago. From a biophysical point of view, mTOR and AMPK are like a kind of seesaw in a playground. If insulin is high because we've snacked on something or because we're stressed, mTOR weighs a lot and AMPK is up in the air, kicking its legs, unable to touch the ground. In other words, it is physically impossible to activate deep cleaning while the materials truck, that is, while insulin, keeps unloading bricks at the front door. You can't simply do a restoration, especially not a deep, thorough restoration, of the cathedral frescoes if there are 500 workers all shouting, talking loudly, and pouring cement down the hallways. For such delicate work, you need the trucks to stop rumbling, the construction lights to go out, and for silence to reign completely. Only then, in that nutrient void, in that absolute stillness, can Ohsumi's specialized maintenance team finally emerge from the basement, carrying their carefully prepared double-membrane bags, ready to repair the sensitive hardware that the sugar has left damaged. It is only in these rare, quiet moments that the restoration process can truly begin, allowing the team to work with the precision and care that such a task demands. And here, remember one important thing. Autophagy is not about starving. Autophagy is technical sovereignty. It is effectively allowing your entire operating system to thoroughly clear the cache, delete any corrupted files, and finally begin to work again with the absolute clarity of a piece of freshly polished glass. You see, a moment ago I was telling you about the importance of silence so that Ohsumi's cleaning can begin. But of course you might say, but I can't see my cells. How do I know if there is silence in my cathedral or if Sergeant Insulin is still shouting? Well, look, it turns out you have a highly precise sensor installed in the center of your chest, your heart. But I'm not talking about whether it beats fast or slow, because that's what a regular gym heart rate monitor checks. No, I'm referring to the level of cardiac microelectronics. And here, I want you to imagine a metronome like the ones musicians use. Tick, 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 tick. Always the same, perfect, rigid. Well, if your heart beat like that, you'd have a serious engineering problem. Because science tells us that a healthy heart is not a metronome. It's more like a jazz musician. And here you see, there's a measure called heart rate variability, or HRV in English. And pay close attention, it doesn't measure beats per minute, but rather the infinitesimal space between one heartbeat and the next. Between beat A and B, it might be 0.82 seconds, and between B and C, 0.75. That small variation, that apparent chaos, that is the sign that your cathedral is flexible. And this is what researchers like Dr. Julian Tyers, who is an authority in psychology and autonomic cardiology, call systemic resilience. If your heart is able to change its rhythm by the millisecond, it means your operating system is awake, alert, and ready to repair. Your cleaning software is in control. But what happens when the insulin sergeant doesn't go to sleep because you simply don't stop eating or you don't stop being stressed? And this is where physics becomes relentless. You see, Studies published in prestigious journals like the Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism have shown something fascinating. Chronic hyperinsulinemia, that is, having high insulin levels all the time, acts as a direct stimulant of the sympathetic nervous system, the one you don't want to activate. And I'll explain it so you understand it like this. If you were a small child, high insulin is like having an alarm, a fire alarm, going off very softly but 24 hours a day. It's a constant metabolic noise. And your body interprets that if there's so much insulin, it's basically because there's a perpetual supply emergency. So what does your electrical system do in an emergency? It activates what is called the fight or flight mode. And that constant noise keeps your nerves on red alert. And as long as you're on red alert, your vagus nerve, which is the main cable that carries the order for calm, digestion, and repair, stays silent. It's as if the cable were cut. What is the consequence? That if there's no repair, there's no cleaning. Think of your cathedral, your body. At night, it would make sense for the lights to go out, the generators to rest, and the cleaning crews to come in and polish the floors. But when you have high insulin levels, the lights are blazing away at their absolute full power at 3 o'clock in the morning. The massive generators are roaring loudly, and the busy workers are still shouting to one another. All the air is stale and the heart is subjected to that bombardment of stress signals. What happens is that it loses its variability, it becomes a rigid heart, it turns into a grey and frightened metronome because the system is exhausted. You see, researchers like Dr. Maria Gerritsen have explored how this cardiac rigidity is the first warning that the structure is about to fail. If your heart doesn't enter deep recovery mode because insulin won't let it, what you're doing is depleting your biological generators. You're living in a state of permanent emergency. And this is where I want you to connect the dots. If your heart's dashboard is sending or signaling a red alert for rigidity, it's because the software has lost control of the hardware. It's as if in a power plant, you see that the boilers are about to explode, but the computers say everything is fine. When the software, that is, when the chemistry of insulin gets stuck in an infinite loading loop, you can't just wait for the program to fix itself, because if you wait, the structure will collapse. And now that we have carefully looked at the main dashboard and clearly seen that the critical insulin warning lights are flashing bright red, what exactly are we going to do about this situation? Because as I'm telling you, we can't just sit around waiting for the software to fix itself, because it's not going to fix itself. And as engineers, we know that when the program gets stuck in an infinite loop, you simply have to pull the physical lever and stop it. Since the main operating system has become completely locked up and unresponsive, we are going to have to carry out a specialized physical engineering intervention. It is what we would typically call a manual override procedure. Essentially, a direct hands-on intervention on the internal hardware components to simply force the physical switch to finally become unstuck and functional again, with or without the permission of chemistry. And I want you to understand this clearly. This isn't about eating less to lose weight, because that's accountant's arithmetic, and we're engineers. What we're going to do is send high-frequency physical signals, thank you, directly to the foundations of your cathedral. And we're going to carry out a series of physical maneuvers so powerful that they will force the hardware to respond out of sheer survival instinct, manually unsticking that switch, whether or not the sergeant gives us permission. And take note, because these are the 3 specific and powerful biophysical rescue maneuvers that will bring back a sense of profound peace to your heart and thoroughly cleanse every single one of your cells. Here begins your rescue protocol. First, forget about diets and forget about counting calories. As I was saying, that's just accountant's arithmetic. If your heart sensor tells us that the system is saturated with noise and the charging switch is blocked, we have to intervene. We're not going to ask chemistry for permission. We're going to use physics directly to force the system to restart. Well then, next I'm going to introduce you to the 3 high-frequency maneuvers that will restore peace to your heart and cleanse your cells. The first maneuver is to recover the rhythm. Very simple. I want you to stop seeing fasting as going hungry because that's a very poor perspective, almost like a punishment, I'd say. In our cathedral, fasting is a period of technical maintenance. And why is it necessary? Well, you'll see, this is where Dr. Sachin Panda from the Salk Institute comes in. Dr. Panda is one of the world's leading authorities on what we call circadian rhythms. Panda has shown that our metabolism is not a straight line that always works the same way. No. He has shown that it is an oscillator, like the pendulum of a clock. And you see, biophysically, your cell membrane functions like a capacitor. You already knew this. And a capacitor is an electronic component that stores energy, but it has a limit. If you keep charging it 24 hours a day without rest, what happens is that the insulating material inside, the dielectric we've also talked about, heats up, degrades, and eventually ends up burning out. This is what medicine calls inflammation, but we call it dielectric failure. By limiting the hours during which you eat, what you're doing is creating a window of electrical silence. You're giving the capacitor in your membrane a break. And in that silence, the voltage stabilizes, the insulator cools down. And the polarity switch, which was under unbearable pressure, can finally release and return to its resting position. In other words, it's about allowing the cell to regain its ability to retain energy in a healthy way. But sometimes the switch is so rusted from years of sugar that silence isn't enough. And that's when we need a jolt of tension. And that's where my favorite brute force maneuver comes in. Cryoactivation, which is the second strategy. When you expose your body to cold, whether it's a cold shower or simply stepping out into the fresh morning air, what you're doing is sending an immediate distress signal to your power plants, the mitochondria. Surprising, isn't it? And here you see we have to mention Dr. Shingo Kajimura, also from Harvard, because he is the man who knows brown fat best. And here, pay close attention. White fat, the kind you have in excess and is visible, is just a passive storage. But brown fat is a high-tech furnace. Cold exposure activates a magical protein called UCP1. In the world of engineering, this is exactly what we would call a controlled short circuit. Normally, the mitochondria produce energy, but when UCP1 is activated by the cold, the mitochondria stop producing energy and start generating only heat. And what does this have to do with insulin? Absolutely everything. Because when faced with the risk of freezing, as I just explained, the system activates an emergency protocol that ignores the orders of Sergeant Insulin. In other words, survival through heat is more important than saving energy. And it turns out that the cold bypasses the electrical blockade of the bunker and forces the switch to turn to discharge, burning glucose and fat at a dizzying speed. Look at the bridge we've just built. It's a thermal reset that unclogs the switch purely out of thermodynamic necessity. But there's even more. Let's move on to the third point. Finally, if chemistry has failed us and the cold has woken us up, thank you. Now we're going to use mechanics to finish cleaning out the corridors. This is what I call the vacuum exercise. You see, think of your muscles as engines that have their own little fuel tank. It's called glycogen, which is the sugar that muscles store. Well, when you do an intense activity, you basically empty those tanks, and by emptying them, you create a real pressure vacuum inside the engine. You see, researchers like Dr. Erik Richter from the University of Copenhagen have demonstrated something that sounds incredible. It turns out that when the muscle contracts forcefully, it activates the pathway called AMPK. Do you remember our logistics engineer I mentioned to you a few minutes ago? Yes, it's the same one. And this pathway is so powerful that it forces the sugar antennas, the GLUT4, to come out to the surface without the need for insulin. It's as if the main door of the cathedral were blocked by the sergeant, but you, out of sheer mechanical necessity, simply open all the side windows so that the supply can get in. By the process of establishing this internal vacuum, the body is compelled to manually flip and reconfigure the polarity of the switch to extract vital energy from any available source, even from that stubborn fat stored deep within the bunker, in order to fill the significant gap you have left behind in the muscle. And look, this isn't about the calories that you burn while you're moving. It's because of the suction effect that you leave established in your system for the hours that follow. You have forced the export of load simply by using the laws of pressure. But now give me one more minute, because I think it's very important to recap what I just explained to you. Pay close attention to the operations map we've just outlined. We haven't talked about eating less. What we're doing is executing a pincer maneuver on our own biology using three fundamental forces. On one hand, the electrical silence. When you limit your eating hours, what you're doing is you stop charging the capacitor and you allow the insulation of your cells to cool down and stop burning from inflammation. Second, with cryoactivation, you use a thermal emergency to create a shortcut to the software of Sergeant Insulin. That is, you are forcing the switch to turn toward discharge in order to burn fat at an incredibly fast rate. And third, with the vacuum exercise, what we do is use mechanics to suck the energy out, because by forcefully contracting your muscles, you activate the AMPK pathway and open the doors to sugar without asking insulin for permission. It's a coordinated attack. This is about using time, temperature, and mechanics to force that rusty switch to turn once and for all. Well, as you've seen today, regaining your health is not a battle of willpower against a plate of food. No, basically, it's a matter of technical sovereignty. If you keep that switch in charging mode 24 hours a day, your cathedral will eventually collapse under the weight of its own savings. You have to learn to value silence. That is, you have to learn to turn off the signal, stop eating fast. And when you regain your polarity, you regain your ability to shine. You stop being a prisoner of your own accumulated energy and instead become the true chief engineer who decides when to build and, above all, when to clean. But please be very careful, because our intervention definitely doesn't end here. It is completely useless to have learned exactly how to flip the metabolic switch. If your individual cells have already decided to put on heavy noise-cancelling headphones and ignore every single signal you are trying to send them, Sometimes the bombardment they've suffered has been so intense that your system develops electrical deafness. That is, the antennas, those GLUT4 transporters I mentioned, simply hide in the basement to avoid getting burned by all the noise. In the next step of our engineering, we are going to learn how to perform a biophysical bypass. We are going to clear the static from your operating system so that your body, and mine too of course, not only can release energy, but can also hear the signal again with absolute clarity. Here, it's about regaining control of the machine and knowing that you can do what it takes for your cathedral to start shining again. Once you know the way, it's just a matter of walking it. If you liked the video and think it could be useful to others, you would be doing me a big favor by sharing it, because you'll help me spread knowledge and awaken others from that dehydration and chronic lethargy that probably keeps them asleep in a dark cathedral. As I always tell you, go ahead, always forward, and I'll read your comments